The studio lights dimmed. An 81-year-old man sat still, fingers interlaced, eyes lowered as if he were about to confess something he had spent a lifetime hiding. And then, softly, he said, "I loved her, but I never told her." The words fell into the air, cold, weightless, and absolute. Even the interviewer froze. Half a century of silence dissolved in that single moment. She was Meryl Streep, the woman who shared with him some of cinema's most hauntingly beautiful moments, yet remained forever out of reach. Why could two people understand each other so deeply and still never fall in love? Perhaps some souls mirror each other too perfectly. And love, instead of saving them, would have broken the spell. This is the story of Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep, two legends who kept their love in the only place it could survive, in silence. And today, decades later, we open that door to understand why sometimes the most beautiful love is the one that never happened. They were never lovers, and that was precisely what made the world obsessed with them. From the first moment Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep appeared together on screen, something wordless passed between them, a current that didn't belong to the script. Viewers felt it instantly, that quiet electricity, that ache of recognition. It was not acting. It was something else, something too real to fit inside a film. In The Deer Hunter 1978, they played two souls scarred by war, reaching for tenderness in a world that no longer knew how to feel. What audiences didn't know was that behind the camera, another kind of silence lingered, one built of admiration, grief, and the fragile boundary between art and emotion. Meryl was mourning John Cazale, her dying partner, during the shoot. De Niro, already a legend after Taxi Driver, protected her fiercely, quietly, without ever crossing the invisible line. He spoke little, but his presence steadied her. On set, he would sit beside her between takes, not to comfort, but simply to exist in the same air. That was his way of loving, wordless, contained, hidden behind the precision of his craft. For Meryl, that restraint was both safety and torment. She understood it too well. They were, after all, the same kind of actor, meticulous, inward, allergic to pretense. Two method performers who built entire worlds inside their silences. To love someone like that would mean breaking the wall that protected their art. Hollywood, however, adored the illusion. Magazines called them the perfect match of intellect and soul. Directors dreamed of reuniting them. When they worked again on Falling in Love 1984, the public's fantasy reached fever pitch. The film was gentle, human, almost mundane. But beneath its quiet realism, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Each glance, each unfinished sentence between them carried the weight of everything unsaid. It was as if they had agreed to act out the relationship they could never live. Every scene felt like confession disguised as fiction, the way De Niro would hesitate before touching her face, or the way Meryl's eyes lingered on him half a second too long. The camera captured what they themselves refused to acknowledge. But illusion has its own gravity. The more perfectly they played their roles, the further they drifted from the possibility of truth. Hollywood celebrated their chemistry, unaware that it was born from repression. To the audience, they were icons of emotional honesty to each other. They were mirrors reflecting what they could never allow themselves to feel. They met at award shows, exchanged polite smiles, small talk, mutual admiration, always respectful, always professional, never reckless, never real. behind every public photograph of them together. There was a line neither dared to cross, the same invisible thread that kept them both safe and aching. For De Niro, love had always been something he controlled. His craft demanded isolation amongst discipline. Emotion, to him, was sacred only when it belonged to the work. To give it away in life felt like contamination. Meryl, meanwhile, carried her own armor. The death of John Cazale had sealed something inside her, a promise never to love without purpose again. To love De Niro would have meant reopening the wound that nearly destroyed her once before. So they stayed in character, not for a film, but for life itself. Two people who understood everything about emotion, yet chose distance as a form of survival. They didn't need words. The silence between them said enough. And maybe that was the cruelest illusion of all, that they convinced the world they had it all figured out, when in truth, they were both haunted by what could never be. As decades passed, the illusion hardened into legacy. Their names became shorthand for excellence method, mastery, control. No scandal, no rumors, no chaos, only precision. But under that flawless surface lived a truth they both carried like a hidden scar, that sometimes the cost of perfection is love itself. For Meryl and Robert, that illusion, the image of restraint, of professionalism, of mutual respect, became their prison. It protected them from heartbreak. It also denied them the very thing their art existed to express. And so, Hollywood got its myth: two actors too good, too pure, too disciplined to fall for each other. But the myth came at a price. Because somewhere between cut and action, between performance and truth, they left a piece of themselves behind in a story the world believed was fiction, but was in fact their quietest confession. They were perfect on screen. Yes, but perfection in love is another word for distance. It began with death. When Robert De Niro met Meryl Streep on The Deer Hunter, she was living inside a quiet grief that no one could touch. John Cazale, the love of her life, was dying of cancer. And every day on set was a war between art and loss. Most people avoided the subject. De Niro didn't. He simply stayed. He didn't comfort her with words. He didn't try to fix what was unfixable. He just made sure she had someone who understood the language of silence. In that stillness, something delicate began to grow, not a romance. Not yet. But a recognition. A man who never spoke about his feelings. And a woman who felt everything too deeply. Together, they built an invisible bridge, one that would outlast everything else in their lives. The crew saw it. Everyone did. There was a gravity around them that was impossible to name. Michael Cimino, the director, once said they never flirted. They didn't have to. The camera could feel it. And perhaps that was the tragedy from the start, that the truest connection between them only existed when someone was filming it. Meryl used her pain to feed the character. De Niro used the role to hide his. They were both method actors, but their methods came from opposite wounds. She acted to remember. He acted to forget. And somewhere between those two instincts, remembering and erasing their bond formed. After John Cazale's death, Meryl moved out of their shared apartment, broken and untethered. De Niro was one of the few people who called. He offered her a small part in the Deer Hunter sequel discussions, mostly to keep her working, to keep her alive. She didn't know it, but he was already doing what he had always done, saving people by pretending not to. He asked her to star opposite him again 6 years later, in Falling in Love. By then, both were established legends. Yet on that set, Something fragile resurfaced. They were older, more cautious, but the distance between them was still charged with that same ache as if no time had passed. Only silence. The film itself mirrored their reality, two married people drawn to each other, hesitating at the edge of something they can't name. On screen, they kissed tenderly, almost shyly, but when the director called cut, they both stepped back, eyes lowered, like strangers who had just shared a secret too intimate for daylight. That was not acting. That was confession. Meryl once said in an interview years later with Bob, "There's something unsaid." It's like standing in front of a mirror that knows too much. The line was dismissed by journalists as metaphor. It wasn't. Behind that metaphor lay a lifetime of repression, a friendship suspended in the tension of what could have been. They never spoke of it, never allowed the words to escape, because both knew that once spoken, the illusion would die. And for artists like them, illusion was oxygen. Robert De Niro's friends often described him as emotionally unavailable, even to those closest to him. He could play the most vulnerable men on screen, but off camera, he was a vault. He once admitted, "If you open up too much, you lose control. And control is all I've got." Meryl understood that too well. She had built her own fortress, one made not of control, but of empathy. Her gift was to feel everything, and her curse was that it never turned off. To love someone like De Niro, someone who feared his own emotions, would have been like handing him the trigger to her own undoing. So they stayed on opposite sides of the same wound, circling it, respecting it, never crossing the line. Their relationship became a meditation on what cannot be lived, only felt. They sent each other scripts over the years, called occasionally, appeared together at tributes, always with that same restrained tenderness. The air between them was never casual, it carried too much history. One producer recalled a dinner after an award ceremony. Meryl was laughing with friends. De Niro arrived late. The moment she saw him, the table fell quiet. She said his name, Bob, in a tone no one had ever heard before. It was a whisper, half a sigh. He nodded, said nothing, but his eyes softened. For 10 seconds, the entire room seemed to disappear. That's how their love lived, not in declarations, but in microseconds of recognition. The tragedy of their connection was not what they lost, but what they never allowed to exist. Both built their careers on truth, yet neither could afford to live it. They became prisoners of their own integrity, and as the years passed, their choices calcified into legacy. De Niro married, divorced, became a father. Meryl found lasting love with Don Gummer, a man who gave her stability after chaos. Yet even then, traces of De Niro lingered in the way she spoke about emotional honesty, in her guarded admiration when asked about her co-stars. She never denied him. She just never explained him. They met again briefly in 1996 for Marvin's Room. Both older now. Both different. Both pretending it was just another job. But the moment the camera rolled, everything they had buried came flooding back. Meryl later said, "Sometimes, it's like the past is hiding under your skin. You don't plan to feel it. It just finds you." That's what De Niro was for her, the past that never left. The unfinished chapter written in invisible ink. Their connection endured not because it was secret, but because it was sacred. It lived in the pauses between words, in the looks that lasted one heartbeat too long, in the shared understanding that they had chosen the safer path, the one without destruction, without confession, but also without the warmth of what might have been. For Robert, silence became both punishment and protection. For Meryl, it became memory. And together, that silence became their legacy, a monument to the love that art created but life could not sustain. They had been everything to each other except lovers. And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes, the deepest love is not meant to be lived, it's meant to remain unfinished, eternal, untouched. And so, the world continued to believe the illusion. But beneath that illusion, the truth was unbearably human. That two people could meet the one person who understood them completely and still have to walk away. It happened quietly, as if the truth had been waiting for the right season to come out. Robert De Niro, at 81, seated under the dim lights of a studio, finally said the words he had never allowed himself to speak. I loved her, but I never told her. There was no shock in his voice, only fatigue. A surrender that comes when a man realizes time has erased his last excuse. It was not a confession meant for headlines. It was a whisper to the past. After 5 decades of silence, he had finally broken the rule that defined his life. Never let emotion escape the frame. The interviewer didn't interrupt. De Niro's eyes drifted somewhere far beyond the room, perhaps to the set of The Deer Hunter, where he first watched Meryl hold back tears for a dying lover, perhaps to falling in love, when their characters kissed for the first time, and he felt something too close to truth. In that moment, it was clear the line between fiction and reality had never been real at all. The revelation wasn't that he loved her, people had suspected that for years. The revelation was that he regretted not saying it. De Niro, the man who built his legend on control, had finally admitted that his greatest role was also his greatest failure, the man who could embody any emotion, except his own. And when he finally spoke, the world realized that the most disciplined actor of his generation had lived his entire life afraid of the one thing he portrayed best: love. Friends close to him said the confession came after years of loss. His parents, his marriages, his aging body, everything was slowly being stripped away until only truth remained. And when everything else is gone, truth is all that's left to speak. That was his reckoning, the understanding that love unspoken does not disappear, it calcifies. It waits. It shapes every role, every silence, every look that lingers too long. When asked if Meryl ever knew, he smiled faintly. She did. He said, "Of course she did." It was the kind of answer that wasn't meant to explain, only to acknowledge, because between them, knowing had always been enough. Their silence had not been ignorance, it was consent. Both had chosen to protect something fragile, the purity of what existed between them, from the noise of the world. But love, even unspoken, leaves marks. Every time De Niro played a man holding something inside, from raging bull to heat, a trace of her was there. And Meryl, in her endless empathy, seemed to echo him too, the quiet, measured pauses, the eyes that saw too much. Their art had carried what their hearts could not. That is the cruel symmetry of their story. The very thing that made them geniuses: restraint, discipline. Distance was what doomed them to live parallel lives, forever circling a truth they never touched. In the years after his confession, journalists revisited their old interviews. The signs had always been there. When Meryl was asked to describe De Niro in one word, she said, "Complete." When De Niro was asked the same about her, he answered, "Real." 2 words that sound like admiration, but together, they read like longing. For decades, Hollywood had been chasing their kind of connection, on-screen chemistry that could not be manufactured. But what no one understood was that their chemistry came from something deeper: grief, restraint, and the shared knowledge that they had already missed their chance. The final irony? They never stopped working near each other's orbit. Tributes, charity galas, lifetime awards every few years. The universe found a way to put them on the same stage again. And each time, they greeted like old friends, polite smiles, brief touches, an unspoken warmth that no camera could fake. It was the same performance. Endlessly rehearsed, two people pretending they had never been anything more than colleagues. But when De Niro spoke at a tribute for Meryl years earlier, his voice broke for the first time in public. "She makes everyone better," he said, pausing, even when she doesn't mean to. It was a line that meant everything and nothing. Because what he really meant was, she made me better. And I never told her. And now, at 81, he finally had. Meryl never publicly responded. She didn't need to. Her silence, the same silence that defined their bond, became her answer. No denial. No surprise. Only the quiet dignity of someone who already knew. That was the final revelation. That love, once spoken aloud, loses its protection. And that perhaps De Niro's greatest act of love was not telling her, keeping their connection pure, untarnished by time or gossip or misunderstanding. He had spent a lifetime teaching himself not to feel. And yet, in the end, feeling was all that remained. So when he whispered those words, "I loved her," but I never told her, it wasn't a confession of failure. It was an elegy for everything they had been, and everything they could never be. Because some love stories don't end with goodbye. They end with a sentence that takes half a century to say. In the end, it wasn't about what they did, it was about what they chose not to do. Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep became symbols of restraint, of the beauty that lives inside boundaries. But beneath the discipline and grace, their story is a quiet tragedy, proof that sometimes the greatest performances in life are the ones we give off stage. He built his career by disappearing into characters. She built hers by feeling everything they couldn't. Together, they became the mirror through which art reflected life, two halves of the same impulse, to protect the fragile truth that emotion is both their weapon and their wound. And yet, when the curtain fell, what remained was the question that haunted them both. Can you truly love someone if you never say it aloud? Or is silence, when it comes from understanding, its own kind of confession? De Niro's late admission was not a scandal, it was an act of liberation. A man who had spent his life mastering control finally surrendered to the simplest truth of all, that love unspoken is still love. It doesn't vanish, it becomes part of who you are. Meryl's silence in return was her answer, not denial, not surprise. Just the quiet mercy of someone who has already forgiven. Their story reminds us that not every connection must be fulfilled to be real. Some loves are meant to shape, not to possess. To pass through our lives like a shadow that teaches us what light feels like. Hollywood will remember their films, the precision, the mastery, the subtle chemistry that no script could explain. But what will last longer is the humanity behind them, the cost of perfection, the loneliness beneath brilliance, the fragility behind the mask of control. In another life, they might have loved freely. In this one, they turned that love into art. And maybe that was the only way it could survive. Because when the lights fade and the applause is gone, all that remains is the silence between two people who once recognized themselves in each other and chose to keep that recognition sacred. Some love stories burn. Theirs endured quietly, endlessly, like a film that never needed an ending.